Racist woman thought snatching Big Shaq's mother's 50-year-old house was just another quiet win. But the house wasn't empty. It was heavy with history, memory, and pride. And when Big Shaq returned, it wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning. In a town used to silence, the ground itself seemed to shift when legacy walked back through the door. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun cast a golden hue over the quiet neighborhood, its rays dancing upon the weathered facade of a grand old house. This wasn't just any house. It was a monument to resilience, a testament to the enduring spirit of a family that had weathered countless storms. Built by Shaquille O'Neal's great-great-grandfather, a man who had once toiled as a freedman, the house stood as a symbol of hope and perseverance. Its walls had absorbed the laughter of children, the whispers of secrets, and the silent prayers of generations. Lucille O'Neal, now in her late 60s, approached the house with a sense of anticipation. The familiar creak of the porch steps, the scent of blooming magnolias, and the gentle rustle of the wind through the ancient oak trees all welcomed her home. But as she reached for the doorknob, her hand met resistance. The door, which had always opened with ease, refused to budge. Confused, she looked down and saw a shiny new lock, foreign and uninviting. Her eyes scanned the doorframe until they landed on a crisp white paper, stark against the dark wood. The words "Notice of Property Seizure" were emblazoned at the top in bold letters. Lucille's heart sank as she read the document, each word more devastating than the last. The house, her sanctuary, had been claimed by someone named Eleanor Grace. Eleanor Grace was a name that resonated with infamy in the town. A woman of considerable means and questionable morals, she had a reputation for exploiting legal loopholes to acquire properties, often targeting those who lacked the resources to fight back. Her disdain for the town's black community was thinly veiled, her actions cloaked in legality but driven by prejudice. Lucille's mind raced. How could this have happened? The house had been in her family for over a century and a half. It was more than a structure. It was a repository of memories, of love, of legacy. She felt a surge of determination. This was not just about bricks and mortar. It was about justice. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling, as she dialed her son's number. Shaquille, affectionately known as Big Shaq, answered on the second ring. His deep voice, always a source of comfort, brought tears to her eyes. "Mom? Everything okay?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. Lucille took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Shaquille, someone has taken our house. There's a notice on the door. It's been seized by Eleanor Grace." There was a pause on the line, a silence filled with unspoken emotions. Then, with a calm resolve, Shaquille replied, "I'm coming home, Mama. We'll fix this." As the call ended, Lucille felt a glimmer of hope. Her son, a man of immense stature and even greater heart, would stand by her side. Together, they would confront this injustice, not with anger, but with unwavering determination. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house, though locked and silent, seemed to stand taller, as if bracing itself for the battle ahead. Inside, the walls held their breath, awaiting the return of the family that had given them life. Lucille turned away from the door, her steps purposeful. She would not be defeated. The house that held generations would not fall into the hands of hatred. With her son by her side, she would reclaim what was rightfully theirs. As she walked down the path, neighbors peeked through curtains, whispers spreading like wildfire. The town was abuzz with the news, the lines between right and wrong becoming clearer with each passing moment. The stage was set, the players in place. A confrontation loomed on the horizon, one that would test the very fabric of the community. But Lucille was ready. The house that held generations would not be lost, not on her watch. The sun barely dipped below the horizon, casting a dusky glow over the neighborhood, while Lucille O'Neal sat at the edge of her porch steps, her face etched with both sadness and fury. Behind her, the house, an enduring monument of her family's legacy, stood cloaked in silence, as though it were holding its breath. The wooden boards of the house, worn smooth by decades of footsteps and the weight of generations, seemed to creak softly in the evening breeze, whispering secrets of the past into the cooling air. Inside those walls, the stories of births, deaths, love, and loss were imprinted like echoes in an ancient cave. The scent of Sunday dinners, the laughter of children playing hide and seek, the solemn prayers whispered during times of hardship. All of it lingered in the grain of the old timber and the plaster that sealed the rooms. The house wasn't just a home, it was a vault of collective memory. When Lucille's ancestors first built it, long before electric lights and paved streets, it was with their own hands, under the oppressive gaze of those who believed they didn't belong. Every nail driven and beam raised was a declaration of resilience, a silent vow that their legacy would endure. But now that vow was threatened by the arrogance of Eleanor Grace. She wasn't just taking possession of a house, she was erasing the story that lived inside it. Eleanor, with her sharp suits and sharper words, didn't see the memories. She saw opportunity. The same way her family had once turned their backs on justice and integrity, Eleanor now sought to rewrite history, to erase the traces of those who had made that house a living testament to survival and dignity. In her cramped apartment in the city, Lucille's son, Shaquille O'Neal, stared at the phone in his hand. The weight of his mother's trembling voice still echoed in his mind, a mixture of disbelief and quiet resolve. Lucille had tried to stay calm during their conversation, but her words had cracked under the pressure of loss. The image of his mother, proud, unyielding, but now forced to stand helplessly outside the home that bore her family's soul, burned in his thoughts. Shaquille felt his fists clench involuntarily, but he quickly released the tension. He knew that anger wouldn't win this battle. It would only cloud his judgment. He rose from his seat, his towering frame brushing against the low ceiling. His apartment, modest and humble despite his wealth, reflected his values. Solid wood bookshelves lined with biographies of changemakers, and framed photos of his mother smiling through the decades. The walls here whispered too, but they whispered encouragement, reminding him of who he was and where he came from. He grabbed his jacket and keys, his mind already mapping out the steps he would take. As he drove through the city streets, the sun sank lower, casting long shadows over the buildings. The hum of traffic and the flicker of neon signs contrasted starkly with the quiet dignity of the old house in his mind. Shaquille's thoughts churned, not with rage, but with strategy. He couldn't confront Eleanor with fists or threats. He would confront her with truth, with the undeniable weight of history and the law. But more than that, he would confront her with his presence, a presence she couldn't dismiss, a presence that carried the weight of generations. Meanwhile, back at the house, Lucille sat on the front steps, listening to the creaking of the porch, the occasional rustle of wind in the magnolia trees. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, telling her stories of endurance and courage. She imagined her father standing tall, facing the discrimination of his time with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any protest. She thought of her own children, of Shaquille, and of the path they had walked together. The house was more than wood and stone. It was the heart of her family, a place where every scar on the floor and every mark on the wall told a story of survival. Eleanor Grace, sitting in her modern office across town, likely believed she had already won. With her legal papers signed and the notice posted, she probably assumed that an elderly woman like Lucille would quietly disappear, taking her family's history with her. But Eleanor didn't understand the depth of the roots she was trying to pull. She didn't understand that the house itself seemed to resist her claim, standing stubbornly against the intrusion, its very walls whispering defiance. Shaquille's car turned onto the familiar street, his headlights sweeping over houses that had once felt like part of a larger, welcoming tapestry. Now the neighborhood felt fractured, the comfortable familiarity marred by the ugly reality of Eleanor's ambition. As he approached, he slowed, parking at the curb and stepping out into the cooling air. The weight of history pressed down on him, but so did the strength of his purpose. He stood for a moment, gazing at the house. He saw the slumped figure of his mother on the porch, and the silent judgment of the house's facade. But he also saw the legacy that Eleanor couldn't touch, the strength of a family that had survived worse, the quiet determination that echoed through generations. His footsteps were deliberate as he approached, and with each step he felt the weight of the past and the clarity of his mission settle into place. The house seemed to recognize his arrival. The whispers in the walls grew louder in his mind, not with fear but with anticipation. This wasn't just about reclaiming property, it was about standing up against erasure, against the quiet violence of being told your history doesn't matter. Shaquille didn't need to shout, he didn't need to threaten. His presence was enough. The story wasn't over, and the house wasn't silent, not yet. Eleanor Grace sat behind her antique mahogany desk in a pristine white office that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old secrets. The blinds were half drawn, allowing slices of afternoon sun to creep across the hardwood floors like silent intruders. Her lips curled into a thin, knowing smirk as she reviewed a folder stamped "Transfer Complete." It was all routine to her by now. The paperwork, the signatures, the untraceable trail of fine print manipulations that led her from interest to ownership. She didn't steal with a crowbar. She stole with ink and patience. She'd been watching Lucille O'Neal from the comfort of her car earlier that morning, parked just down the street behind tinted glass, sipping lukewarm coffee and savoring the moment. The old woman had stood there, disbelief unraveling her posture, as she tugged gently on the doorknob like someone checking if a nightmare could be undone. Eleanor knew that look. The dazed hurt, the shaken pride. She'd seen it before. In fact, she thrived on it. Eleanor's rise in the town was not marked by kindness or community. She was the type of woman who was always just legal enough. Her last dozen acquisitions had earned her whispers and back-turned glances at church events. Yet no one dared confront her directly. She wrapped herself in the armor of law, always one clause ahead, always smiling just enough to pass through polite society. But those who looked closer saw the cracks, neighbors who remembered her father's schemes, a teacher who recalled Eleanor's childhood cruelty, a former friend who once said, "She doesn't fight fair. She fights quiet." Beneath that poise and confidence lived something colder. Eleanor never truly recovered from the sting of never being accepted beyond transactional terms. Born into a family whose name meant money but not respect, she'd grown up with a chip on her shoulder, believing she deserved power and reverence. So she went out and took both, one deed at a time. Her targets were rarely random, they were strategic. Old families, vulnerable title, and homes like Lucille's, soaked in history, rooted in stories Eleanor would never be part of. She opened a side drawer and pulled out a crisp manila folder marked with Lucille's name. Inside was a copy of the disputed deed, a web of technicalities and loopholes so dense that even the most seasoned property lawyers would have to pause. The document wasn't exactly fake, but it wasn't clean either. Eleanor knew it. She also knew Lucille wouldn't have the means or the will to challenge her. At least, that's what she thought. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, and for a brief moment she hesitated. There was something in Lucille's eyes that morning, something that had haunted her for hours after she'd driven away. Not desperation, not even defeat. It was dignity, a kind of quiet resilience that had no place in Eleanor's world of leverage and control. She had expected outrage or pleading. Instead, Lucille had simply stood there, hurt but unbowed, like a tree still rooted after the wind has done its worst. Eleanor shook the thought away and turned toward her window. From her vantage point, she could see the distant stretch of the neighborhood, where the O'Neal house stood like a monument to a past Eleanor had always resented. The truth was, she didn't just want the house, she wanted what it represented. The way people still nodded respectfully at Lucille in the market. The way the community seemed to rally around the O'Neals without question. She wanted that reverence, but never earned it. So, in her own twisted logic, she decided if she couldn't belong to that history, she'd bury it. In her mind, she replayed the memory of her father sneering at the town's integration efforts, calling it softening tradition. That same man had taught her that strength wasn't inherited. It was seized. But what he never taught her was that taking something didn't mean you owned it. She never understood legacy. Only leverage. As Eleanor walked slowly across her office to refill her coffee, her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant popped up. "He's coming, Shaquille O'Neal just landed." Her fingers froze mid-air. The mug trembled slightly in her hand, and for the first time in days, her smirk wavered. She hadn't planned for this. The son, Big Shaq. The local legend, with national fame. A man who carried not just muscle and money, but public affection and influence. His involvement shifted everything. She stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the development settle. This wasn't just about a bitter woman and an old house anymore. This was about to become something public. Something the town would talk about at every church gathering and city council meeting. Shaquille was known for keeping quiet, for being generous, grounded, but he was also known for never backing down when it mattered. And this, Eleanor knew deep down, mattered to him. A bead of sweat slipped along her temple. She returned to her desk and pulled open another drawer, this one deeper, older. Inside were files she never showed anyone. Old deals, hushed settlements, documents that if uncovered, could unravel her carefully crafted image. Her hands hovered over them, the implications heavy. She didn't need to be told that Shaquille O'Neal was not the kind of man you bullied or blindsided. His silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor Grace didn't feel certain. She felt watched, exposed, vulnerable. And not by courts or contracts, but by the creeping truth she'd spent a lifetime dodging. The kind of truth that arrives not with thunder but with footsteps. Quiet, heavy, purposeful. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, Eleanor Grace returned to her chair, her smirk gone. She stared down at Lucille's name on the folder. No longer just paper but prophecy. And though she didn't say it aloud, one thought echoed louder than all the others. She should have never underestimated the house, or the people who called it home. In a bustling corner of the city, where laughter bounced off brick walls, and the scent of fresh paint mingled with the earthy aroma of sweat, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to his friends, was doing what he loved most. The worn basketball court of the youth shelter buzzed with energy. Sneakers skidding, balls thudding against backboards. Kids scrambled for passes, called out to each other, and cheered with the uncontainable hope of dreams not yet dimmed by life's harshness. Shaq stood near the court's edge, his towering presence a calm amid the chaos. He wasn't there to dominate, he was there to encourage. His deep resonant laugh rang out as he clapped for a kid who finally made his first layup, his massive hand giving a celebratory high five that nearly swallowed the boy's entire palm. The sun streamed through the high windows, bathing the space in golden light. Shaq's worn sneakers squeaked as he moved across the court, offering pointers, laughing along, and teasing good-naturedly. Here, in this space, he wasn't the millionaire athlete, or the celebrity. He was just a man who remembered what it was like to need guidance, to need someone to believe in you. This shelter had always been a refuge for kids who felt invisible, and Shaq made sure every one of them knew they were seen. The clatter of the ball, the yells of kids, and the occasional buzz of a volunteer's phone created a symphony of life. He was mid-conversation with a young boy named Cody, sharing advice about persistence, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Without breaking the boy's rhythm, he silenced it. But when the call came again, a second and then a third time, Shaq's gut tightened. He pulled the phone out, his smile faltering when he saw his mother's name flashing on the screen. Excusing himself gently, he stepped away from the court's noise and answered. "Hey, Mama," he said, his voice instantly warm, but a sliver of worry threading through his tone. The hum of the shelter faded into the background as he pressed the phone to his ear. "Chocolat." Lucille's voice was quiet, almost trembling, a sound so unlike her usual steady cadence. "They've taken the house." His heart dropped, the words slicing through the ambient noise around him, like a sudden gust of wind through a quiet field. For a moment, the echo of bouncing balls and children's laughter felt distant, almost irrelevant. "What do you mean, Mama?" His voice stayed low, but his posture straightened, a subtle shift that hadn't gone unnoticed by a few nearby volunteers. "There's a notice on the door," she continued, her voice straining against the crack threatening to break it entirely. "Eleanor Grace. She's seized the property. I came home, and I couldn't get in." Shaq's breath slowed as he absorbed the weight of her words. The house, the heart of their family taken, like a page ripped from a story that wasn't finished. His mind raced. He pictured his mother standing alone on the porch, the familiar front door now an unyielding barrier, the memories inside trapped behind locks. He clenched his jaw, his free hand curling into a loose fist at his side. But he didn't speak anger. He spoke resolve. "I'm coming, Mama," he said, his voice steady, rich with quiet strength. "I'll be there soon." Lucille's silence on the other end spoke volumes. He imagined her sitting somewhere near the house, maybe on the steps or in the yard, trying to muster the courage to stand her ground. It wasn't just about losing a home, it was about losing history, about someone trying to erase a family's roots from the earth. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, a flicker of pride weaving through her sadness. "I'll fix this," Shaq promised, his words like a solemn vow etched into the air between them. Ending the call, he stared at the screen for a moment, the noise of the shelter gradually seeping back into his consciousness. He felt the weight of the room shift, as if the kids and volunteers had sensed something had changed. He exhaled, long and controlled, then pocketed his phone. "Something wrong, Shaq?" One of the volunteers, a wiry man named Darren, asked, his brows knitting together. Shaq offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Family business," he replied. His voice was level, but there was a steel edge to it now, a quiet determination that made even Darren step back. He moved to the center of the court, gathered the kids with a wave of his hand. "Hey guys," he called, his deep voice cutting clean through the chatter. "I gotta step out for a bit, but I'll be back. Keep practicing, alright? Remember what we talked about: teamwork, respect, and giving it your all." The kids nodded, some offering hesitant waves, others murmuring encouragements. Shaq clapped one of the older boys on the shoulder, a silent gesture of trust, before grabbing his jacket from the bleachers. As he left, his steps were long, measured, his mind already strategizing. Outside, the city's late afternoon buzz met him like a wall of white noise, but he barely noticed. He wasn't just driving home. He was driving into the heart of a brewing storm, into a confrontation he hadn't anticipated, but was now fully prepared for. The house wasn't just a place where his mother lived. It was a symbol of everything they'd built, everything they'd stood for. He wouldn't let it fall, not to someone like Eleanor Grace. As he merged onto the freeway, the familiar cityscape giving way to stretches of suburban roads, he felt a shift inside him. The man who had laughed with kids on the basketball court was still there, but now he was something more: a protector, a strategist, a son answering a call from the heart. The stakes had changed, and Shaq was ready. The clouds were already gathering when Shaquille's SUV turned onto the familiar streets of his hometown. Thick shadows creeping over sidewalks in the air, carrying the sharp scent of an impending downpour. Thunder rumbled low and distant, a warning that something bigger was building, both in the sky and among the people who called this their home. Shaquille's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening with every mile that brought him closer to the house, to his mother, and to the tangled mess Eleanor Grace had created. On corners and front porches, neighbors gathered in small knots, their voices low, their gazes sharp and uncertain. Whispers spread through the air like smoke. Eleanor Grace had done it again. Some shrugged and turned away, their shoulders sagging with resignation, while others watched with barely concealed anger as Shaq's SUV rolled by, its dark windows catching slivers of street lamp glow. He saw an older man he recognized from childhood, Mr. Hollis, standing by a battered picket fence, his weathered face tight with frustration. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange passing between them. Shaq gave a subtle nod, a promise unspoken but understood. Mr. Hollis turned back to his companions, murmuring something that made one woman purse her lips and shake her head. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about what Eleanor represented: decades of quiet power plays, of sidelong glances at city council meetings, of contracts signed in back rooms with a wink and a handshake. For every neighbor who whispered fearfully, there was another who was beginning to remember that silence was complicity. Shaquille could feel the weight of their gazes as he drove, each one a question he could not yet answer. The sky above thickened, clouds churning like the inside of a thunderhead, the first cold drops of rain tapping against his windshield. As he approached the street, where the old house stood, the tension thickened, the air electric with anticipation. The O'Neal home, even with its boarded-up windows and the stark notice plastered across the door, seemed to stand defiantly against the storm. Its roofline was a silhouette of stubbornness, a sharp contrast to the trembling leaves of the trees that lined the street. Shaquille parked along the curb, stepping out into the gathering dusk, the weight of the storm pressing against his shoulders. His footsteps were heavy, echoing off the cracked pavement. He could feel eyes on him from shadowed windows, but he didn't look back. His focus was on the house, on the battered door, on the memory of his mother's voice filled with quiet resolve. The rain began in earnest as he crossed the yard, drops cold against his skin, but he didn't flinch. The storm above was nothing compared to the storm inside. The questions, the calculations, the knowledge that this confrontation was about more than property. It was about dignity, about community, about history. He could almost hear his ancestors whispering from the walls of the house, voices carried on the wind, urging him to stand firm. Behind him, a voice broke the silence. "Shaq." It was low, cautious. He turned to see a woman he recognized. Nora Dean, once a friend of his mother's, now standing at the edge of the sidewalk, her umbrella tilted against the rain. Her eyes were worried, her posture tense. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice barely rising above the rain's steady drumming. "Eleanor, she's got the papers, but it doesn't feel right. People are scared, Shaq. They think if they stand up to her, they'll lose everything. But they're watching you. They're waiting to see what you'll do." Shaq's jaw tightened. He could see it. The fear, the hesitation. But he also saw the flicker of hope in Nora's eyes. The same flicker he'd seen in Mr. Hollis and the others. They weren't just waiting for him to fix it. They were waiting for a sign that they could stand with him. Not backing down. he said, his voice steady, his gaze locking with hers. She's counting on people staying silent. But this isn't just about my family. It's about all of us. Nora nodded, her lips pressing together. And with a final glance at the house, she turned and disappeared into the deepening twilight, her umbrella bobbing with each step. Shaq returned his gaze to the house, the storm thickening around him, lightning etching jagged lines across the sky. The wind tugged at his jacket, the rain now a steady sheet that blurred the edges of the world. But he stood his ground. Inside his mind, he mapped out the confrontation to come. Eleanor Grace was smug, calculated, but she wasn't invincible. There were cracks in her story, contradictions in her paperwork. His mother had hinted at old records, forgotten documents that might surface. And beyond the legal battle, there was the court of public opinion, neighbors who were slowly awakening from their silence, realizing that Eleanor's control was built on fear and convenience. As thunder rolled across the horizon, Shaquille took a step closer to the house, placing a hand on the doorframe, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm. It was more than wood and nails. It was his family's story etched into the very structure, and he wasn't going to let that story be rewritten by someone like Eleanor Grace. He would stand firm, not just for his mother but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against people like her. Behind him, more neighbors emerged, hesitant at first, then gathering in twos and threes under umbrellas and raincoats. Their presence was quiet but undeniable, a silent testament to the shifting tide. They weren't ready to shout or confront Eleanor directly, but they were watching, waiting, their presence a subtle but growing resistance against the storm's fury. As the rain intensified, drumming against the roofs and streets, Shaquille stood tall, his silhouette stark against the backdrop of the storm. The house loomed behind him, battered but unbroken. The gathering storm wasn't just in the clouds above. It was in the hearts of the people, a storm of rising resolve, and the quiet defiance of a community no longer willing to be silenced. The first blush of dawn painted the horizon with streaks of gold, and rose as Shaquille O'Neal stood at the edge of his mother's yard, his massive frame outlined against the rising sun. The rain from the night before had washed the streets clean, leaving behind a quiet stillness, a calm before a different kind of storm. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and blooming magnolias. It was the hour when most of the town still slumbered, but Shaq was already there, grounded, resolute, ready to face what needed to be faced. At the front door of the house stood Eleanor Grace, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit, her hair pinned back in a style that was meant to project control. She looked up from a stack of papers she was pretending to review as she heard the sound of Shaq's measured steps on the gravel drive. Her lips curved into a thin, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Behind her, the house seemed to lean into the moment, its weathered facade soaking in the growing light, as if gathering strength from the presence of the man who had come to claim it. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice cool, carrying the faintest edge of condescension. "I see you're up early, though I can't imagine what you think showing up here is going to accomplish." Shaq stopped a few feet from her, his posture relaxed but unyielding. He let his gaze sweep over her, taking in the perfectly pressed suit, the too smooth smile, the brittle sharpness of her stance. He saw through the veneer of control to the cracks beneath, the tremor in her fingers as she shuffled her papers, the quick dart of her eyes toward the silent house behind her. He didn't need to raise his voice or puff his chest. His calm was his strength, and it unsettled her more than any shouted accusation could. "I came to make sure you understand," he said quietly, his deep voice resonating like a bassline beneath the morning's stillness. "This house isn't just a building, it's my family's story. My mother's, my grandfather's, my great-grandfather's. It's not for you to erase with your paperwork and your claims." Eleanor's smirk faltered, her hand tightening around the stack of papers. "The law's the law, Mr. O'Neal," she replied, but there was a faint quiver in her tone now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. "I have the documents. The transfer is legal." Shaq took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them like a tide rising inexorably. He didn't need to argue over legalities. Not here. Not now. He was here to remind her, and anyone watching from behind their curtains, or peering from half-opened windows, that some things couldn't be taken with signatures and smirks. His calm, deliberate silence spoke louder than any courtroom speech could. "My mother's name is still on the original deed," he said, his voice low, carrying just enough weight to make her flinch. "There are papers you haven't seen, documents you thought were lost or irrelevant, but they're here, and the truth always has a way of surfacing." Eleanor's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. She felt the shift, the power slipping from her grasp like water through clenched fists. Her confidence, so carefully cultivated through years of quiet manipulation, wavered in the face of his quiet determination. The house seemed to lean toward Shaq, as if recognizing its rightful guardian, as if the walls themselves breathed a sigh of relief. The sun rose higher, bathing the scene in warm light, catching the edges of Eleanor's papers and making them seem suddenly insubstantial, like brittle leaves against the weight of the world. A car passed slowly on the street, its driver glancing at the standoff before continuing on. Birds chirped tentatively from the trees, their voices rising with the morning light. "I'm not leaving," Shaq said simply, "and neither is my family." Eleanor's carefully composed mask finally cracked, a fissure of frustration and desperation appearing beneath the surface. Her voice when it came was sharper, more brittle. "You think you can intimidate me into giving this up?" she snapped, the papers in her hand shaking slightly. "You can't. This is mine now." Shaq's smile was faint, not mocking but filled with quiet certainty. "That's what you think," he said softly. "But this house knows the truth. The town knows the truth. And soon, everyone will know it." He turned, not in retreat, but as a deliberate gesture of finality, a signal that this confrontation was over, at least for now. Eleanor's words stumbled after him, falling flat against the rising morning air, their power drained. The weight of history, of memory, of community had shifted, and it no longer favored her. As Shaq walked back to his car, the door of a neighboring house creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped out, her eyes bright despite the lines etched deep by years. She watched silently, her presence a quiet testament to the changing tide. Across the street, a man stood on his porch, his arms folded, his gaze steady and approving. The neighborhood was waking, not just from sleep, but from the long silence of fear and resignation. Eleanor stood alone by the house, her papers limp in her hand, the rising sun casting long shadows that stretched toward her feet. The confrontation had ended without raised voices or threats, but its impact echoed louder than any argument could. The house, the town, and the truth were no longer silent witnesses. They had spoken through Shaquille's calm presence, and the story was far from over. The air in the old house was thick with dust and memory, as Shaquille O'Neal followed his mother up the narrow staircase toward the attic. Each step groaned beneath their weight, the sound echoing like a low warning through the silent halls. Shaq's broad shoulders barely fit beneath the slanted ceiling, and he ducked instinctively as Lucille pushed open the creaking door at the top. The attic smelled of old wood and forgotten years, the scent of history clinging to every beam and rafter. A single dusty window let in a narrow stream of light that cut through the shadows, illuminating the clutter of trunks and boxes that had sat untouched for decades. Lucille moved with purpose, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a battered chest tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt. Her voice was low, but the weight behind it made Shaq's pulse quicken. "Your grandfather told me about this years ago, when I was just a girl," she said, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting the past to rise up and speak. "He said it was important, but I didn't understand back then. I never thought we'd need it, but now, we do." Shaq crouched beside her, his hands steady as he helped lift the chest's heavy lid. Inside, amidst yellowed papers and faded photographs, was a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked but the pages inside intact. Lucille's fingers traced the edge before she opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. There, written in precise, looping script, was a deed, signed and notarized, transferring ownership of the house to her grandfather's name. But it was what wasn't there that caught Shaq's attention. There was no record of a full transfer to any other party. The supposed chain of ownership Eleanor Grace relied upon had a missing link. The house had never legally left their family. Shaq's breath caught as he read the document, his mind racing through the implications. The house wasn't just his family's by blood and memory, it was theirs by law, and Eleanor's claim was built on sand. He felt a rush of something between relief and determination, a realization that their fight wasn't just moral, it was legal, it was winnable. He looked up at Lucille, whose eyes shimmered with a mixture of pride and regret. "Why didn't we look for this sooner?" he asked, his voice soft, almost reverent. "I didn't think it would come to this," Lucille admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought Eleanor would back down, or that the town would see what was right. I didn't want to dredge up old papers. But when you stood there this morning, so calm and steady, I realized we can't wait for someone else to do what's right. We have to do it ourselves." Shaq nodded, his mind already mapping out the next steps. This deed was more than a forgotten document. It was a key to unlocking the truth, to reclaiming not just the house, but the dignity Eleanor had tried to steal. He closed the ledger gently, as if sealing the promise within, and stood, his height making the attic seem even smaller, the air charged with the weight of generations. As they descended the stairs, the house seemed to settle around them, the creaks and groans no longer ominous but affirming, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. Shaq felt the pulse of history in the walls, the echo of his grandfather's voice, the resilience of a family that had endured too much to be pushed aside by a woman with sharp suits and sharper words. The suspense wasn't just in the attic's hidden secrets, but in what they meant for the fight ahead. In the kitchen, Lucille spread the deed on the table, smoothing the old parchment with care. The morning light now filled the room, chasing away shadows, and for the first time in days, there was clarity. They would take this to the right people. They would show the truth. Eleanor's carefully woven story was about to unravel, and the town would see her for what she was. Shaq's phone buzzed on the counter. A text from a local lawyer he'd called the night before, someone known for integrity and a fierce sense of justice. He glanced at the message, "Meet me at the courthouse at noon. Bring everything you've got." His lips pressed into a determined line. Noon would be soon enough. Lucille's hand trembled as she gently touched his arm. "You're not doing this alone," she said, her voice firm despite the flicker of nerves in her eyes. "We stand together. This is our fight." Shaq looked at her, seeing not just his mother, but the strength of every ancestor who had built this house, who had lived through hardship and hope. He nodded, placing his hand over hers, steady and reassuring. "We'll win this, Mama. For them, for us." The quiet tension between them shifted into something stronger. Resolve. Outside, the neighborhood was waking, the sun climbing higher, its light a silent witness to the secrets that had finally come to light. The suspense wasn't over. It was only just beginning. But now, armed with the truth, Shaquille O'Neal and Lucille were ready to face whatever came next. As the morning sun spread its pale light across Eleanor Grace's office, it caught the glint of her polished desk, the sharp edges of her carefully stacked papers, and the strained lines of her reflection in the window. The confidence that had once defined her posture had begun to crumble, the silence around her suddenly thick, pressing against her thoughts. For years she'd built her world upon controlled manipulations and calculated risks. Now, with Shaquille O'Neal's calm defiance shaking her composure, that world felt paper-thin. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened an old dust-covered ledger hidden in a locked drawer beneath her desk. The worn leather binding and brittle pages felt heavier than they should have. This wasn't just any ledger, it was her family's ledger, one she'd sworn to never reveal. Flipping through the pages, her gaze landed on a familiar damning entry. The entry that should have been buried forever. A transaction forged decades ago when her grandfather had claimed ownership of the O'Neal house using fabricated documents and underhanded dealings. Eleanor's father had continued the charade, refining it with each passing year, until the family's reputation was built upon deceit rather than merit. She had known. She'd always known. The realization twisted in her gut, a silent accusation louder than any courtroom gavel. Her justification had always been that it was business, that the world wasn't fair, and she was merely playing the game better than the others. But watching Shaq stand so firmly before the house that rightfully belonged to his family, seeing the town's quiet, growing resistance to her once unquestioned authority, it gnawed at her. Eleanor's phone buzzed against the desk, a text flashing across the screen. It was a message from a close associate, a man who had once assured her that the documents were airtight. "There are whispers. People are asking questions. The O'Neals found something. Be careful." She swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. The veneer of her confidence cracked further. If the town turned on her, if the truth about her family's actions surfaced, her empire would unravel, not just legally, but socially. The respect she'd fought for, the silent compliance of those too afraid to confront her, would vanish. The past clawed at her memory. She recalled standing in her father's study as a young girl, watching him practice his signature over and over, perfecting the elegant loops that would later appear on deeds and contracts. She had thought it was impressive, a display of control and intellect. But the first time she realized those documents were lies, her stomach had turned with a mixture of awe and fear. She'd grown up believing the world owed her family something, that strength was taken, not given, and she had built her life on that belief, pushing aside the voice that told her it was wrong. But now, with the weight of her actions pressing down and the town's shifting gaze, That voice was impossible to ignore. Across town, Shaq sat at the courthouse. The old deed from the attic spread before a local attorney known for his integrity, a man whose gray temples and sharp eyes had seen decades of courtroom battles. The attorney's lips tightened as he scanned the document, his fingers tracing the signatures. "This," he said quietly, "changes everything. Eleanor's claims won't hold if this comes to light." Shaq nodded, his jaw set. He could feel the tide turning, not because of anger or confrontation, but because of the quiet force of truth. He wasn't out for revenge. He was out for justice, for restoring what had been stolen under the pretense of legality. The lawyer's voice broke into his thoughts. "This will be messy. People will talk. Eleanor has allies, but if you're willing to stand firm, we can win this." "I'm ready," Shaq said simply. He wasn't doing this for accolades or pride. He was doing it because his family's story deserved to be told without lies distorting the truth. Back in her office, Eleanor rose from her desk, pacing the floor as if the act could dislodge the weight pressing against her chest. She glanced at the framed photograph on the wall, an image of her father standing tall beside a courthouse, a satisfied smirk on his face. She used to look at that photo and feel pride, a sense of belonging to something powerful. Now it felt like an indictment, a reminder of every choice that had led her here. Her mind raced through scenarios, grasping at options, but every plan she considered felt flimsy, tainted by the realization that the foundation was rotten. A knock at her door startled her, and she turned sharply. It was her assistant, a young woman with nervous eyes. "Miss Grace, the press is calling. They're asking questions about the house. They're saying the O'Neals have proof." Eleanor waved her off with a trembling hand, sinking into her chair. The walls of her office felt closer now, the air thicker, her own reflection in the window, showing a woman not in control, but cornered. The whispers she had always silenced with power were rising, voices she couldn't suppress. The truth, long buried beneath layers of deception, was clawing its way to the surface. As the town murmured with rumors, and the courthouse prepared for the inevitable legal confrontation, Eleanor Grace sat alone in her office, her legacy crumbling like dry leaves. Her guilt, once buried and rationalized, was now a suffocating presence. For the first time she understood the true weight of history, not as something to be manipulated, but as a force that endured, that remembered, that demanded accountability. In that quiet, suffocating moment, Eleanor realized she was not just losing a house. She was losing the very illusion of control she had built her life upon. The courthouse was a brick and glass structure that stood firm against the morning light, its doors heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. Shaquille O'Neal stepped through them with quiet determination, the worn leather folder containing the attic's long-buried deed clutched in his hand. Lucille walked beside him, her shoulders straight and her chin lifted, though her steps were measured. They were not just entering a building. They were stepping into a moment that could either bury their family's history or let it rise above the lies. Inside, the air was thick with murmurs and rustling papers. Eleanor Grace sat at the opposing table, flanked by her attorney, a man whose sharp suit and colder stare projected confidence he did not entirely possess. Eleanor herself looked composed on the surface, her hair meticulously pinned, but her fingers trembled faintly as she smoothed non-existent creases in her skirt. She glanced up once, locking eyes with Shaq, and for the first time she didn't smirk. Instead, her lips were a thin, colorless line. The judge, an older woman with a reputation for fairness and a sharp eye for deceit, entered the courtroom and called the proceedings to order. Her gavel struck with a crisp crack that seemed to echo louder than necessary, making Eleanor flinch. The room fell silent except for the sound of shuffling papers and the rustle of breath being held. Shaq sat tall, his presence calm and steady, his broad shoulders absorbing the room's tension like a dam holding back floodwaters. Eleanor's attorney stood first, his voice measured as he presented the documentation they claimed proved the transfer of the property to Eleanor. His words were smooth, practiced, but as he spoke the judge's eyes narrowed subtly, flicking to the papers he held up and back to Eleanor. There was a stiffness to her posture, an almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, that betrayed the surface calm. The attorney's voice faltered slightly, as he recounted the lineage of the documents, aware of the thin ice beneath his polished shoes. Then, it was Shaq's turn. His attorney, a local man named Walter Cobb, who knew both the law and the pulse of the town, rose with quiet authority. He spoke not just from the letter of the law, but from the heart of the truth, laying out the timeline and the undeniable evidence. The deed from the attic was introduced with a solemn reverence, the judge leaning forward to inspect it herself. Cobb's voice was firm but not showy, weaving a narrative of family legacy, of rightful ownership denied by deceit and greed. The courtroom held its breath as he revealed how Eleanor's family's fabricated documents had slipped through unnoticed for decades, until now. Lucille's voice broke through the tension, soft but clear, as she rose from her seat. She spoke not as a victim, but as a steward of her family's history. "This house was built by my grandfather's hands," she said, her words steady, her gaze unwavering. "It sheltered generations. My family's name has always been on that deed, even when others tried to erase it. We never left. We were just locked out." The room was silent but for the measured creak of the judge's chair. As she shifted slightly, her expression unreadable. Eleanor's face had paled, her posture stiffening as though each word Lucille spoke was a stone laid upon her chest. For years she had hidden behind legal facades, relying on the power of wealth and intimidation. Now, those defenses cracked under the weight of undeniable truth. Shaq remained still, his presence a silent reinforcement of his mother's words. He wasn't here to gloat or to intimidate. His victory would not come through showmanship but through the quiet, steady assertion of what was rightfully theirs. His calm stood in stark contrast to Eleanor's fraying composure. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, leaning forward. "I have reviewed the evidence presented," she said, her voice measured but carrying an edge that cut through the courtroom's heavy silence. "It is clear that the documentation produced by Miss Grace's counsel is not only incomplete, but contradicted by the original deed provided by the O'Neals. This court recognizes the rightful ownership of the property by the O'Neal family." A collective exhale rippled through the room, the tension breaking like a wave against the shore. Eleanor's hands trembled openly now, her eyes darting as though seeking an exit, an escape from the truth pressing down on her. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, but she pulled away sharply, her mask of control shattered. Lucille sank into her seat, her lips trembling not with fear but with relief. She reached for Shaq's hand, her fingers curling around his with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any words. He squeezed back, his eyes steady, his heart a steady drum of triumph laced with gratitude. Eleanor rose slowly, her movements mechanical, her face a pale mask of defeat. She opened her mouth as if to speak, to object, but no sound came. The weight of the town's gazes pinned her in place, each person in the room a witness to her downfall. For a woman who had always thrived in shadows and whispers, the clarity of this public reckoning was a final, inescapable blow. As the judge rose and the gavel fell one last time, the courtroom stirred to life, conversations erupting in low murmurs, some with relief, others with disbelief. The O'Neal's friends and supporters offered quiet nods of respect and reassurance, their presence a silent but powerful validation. Shaq stood, helping his mother to her feet, his frame towering yet gentle beside her. He didn't look at Eleanor as they left the courtroom. There was no need. The story had been told, the truth revealed, and the dignity of his family's name restored not by force, but by unshakable resolve and the weight of undeniable history. The sun hung low in the sky as Lucille O'Neal stepped across the threshold of her family's house. Her steps slow but steady. The air was filled with the scent of magnolias and fresh earth. The house bathed in a soft, golden light that filtered through the windows long kept shuttered by Eleanor's presence. There was no grand announcement, no crowd cheering, only the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of neighbors watching with cautious hope. Lucille's hand brushed the worn banister as if greeting an old friend, her heart steady with the knowledge that this home, and everything it represented, was hers once more. Behind her, Shaquille stood tall, his broad shoulders relaxed but his gaze vigilant. The tension that had wound through him for days had eased, replaced by a quiet sense of fulfillment. He wasn't just a son reclaiming his mother's home. He was a man reaffirming his family's legacy, his own roots entwined with the walls and floors of this place. As Lucille moved deeper into the house, Shaq followed, his footsteps measured, the creak of the floorboards under his weight a sound both familiar and grounding. Eleanor Grace, now standing just outside the property line, watched in bitter silence. Her carefully curated reputation, once a shield against scrutiny, had crumbled before the town's eyes. No one approached her, no one offered her sympathy. She had built her power on silence and fear, but those tools had turned blunt in the face of truth. The community had watched as her claims collapsed in court, had seen her brittle composure shatter under the weight of evidence. Yet Shaq and Lucille offered no jeers, No public humiliation beyond what Eleanor's own actions had wrought. There was a dignity in their silence. An unspoken understanding that justice didn't require vengeance, only resolution. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, the neighbors began to emerge from behind their curtains. Some approaching quietly, offering nods of respect, tentative smiles, and murmured words of welcome. A few older residents lingered near the edges of the property, their faces lined with years of witnessing injustices, both spoken and unspoken, now softened by a shared recognition of a wrong finally righted. Shaq greeted them with quiet gratitude, his deep voice low and steady as he exchanged brief words, his presence as solid as the house itself. Inside, Lucille stood in the parlor, her fingers trailing along the edges of photographs still hanging on the walls, untouched despite Eleanor's attempts to claim the space. Generations of O'Neals looked back at her from sepia-toned frames, their gazes proud, their legacy intact. She drew a long, steady breath, the weight of her family's history settling back into its rightful place. For a moment, the world outside seemed distant, as though the house itself was exhaling a sigh of relief. Shaq joined her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "It's ours again," he said, his voice resonant in the quiet room. Lucille nodded, her eyes glistening but her smile steady. "It always was. They just forgot." Outside, Eleanor turned abruptly and walked away, her steps hurried, her figure retreating into the encroaching dusk. No one stopped her. The house, the family, and the community had spoken without words, leaving her to reckon with the consequences of her choices. Her departure was not triumphant but necessary, her absence a clearing of space for healing and renewal. As night approached, the neighbors slowly dispersed, leaving Shaq and Lucille standing in the yard, the old house behind them, and the promise of a new chapter ahead. They exchanged a look, unspoken but understood. The fight was over, but the story was far from finished. Days later, the house was alive with quiet energy. Volunteers and friends helped repair what had been neglected. Windows polished to a gleam, the garden tended with care. Children played near the fence, their laughter mingling with the sound of hammers and paintbrushes. The O'Neal home was no longer just a symbol of resistance. It was becoming a symbol of resilience, a place where the community could gather and heal. Shaq returned to the youth shelter, where the basketball court echoed once more with the thump of balls and the laughter of children. The kids greeted him with wide grins and eager stories, their questions spilling over each other. He listened with patience, offering guidance and a steady hand, his presence a constant reminder that strength wasn't just about stature, but about standing tall for what mattered. The shelter buzzed with renewed purpose, its walls infused with the story of what had been reclaimed. One evening, as Lucille sat by the fireplace in the now restored living room, she glanced up toward the attic stairs, her brow furrowing in thought. Shaq noticed and followed her gaze, a question forming on his lips. "There's more up there, isn't there?" he asked quietly. Lucille nodded slowly, her expression contemplative. "Your grandfather mentioned it once. Another box, deeper in the attic, hidden behind the rafters. He said it held something important, something he never had the chance to share." Shaq's curiosity stirred, a subtle thrill of discovery mingling with the sense of closure. "Do you think it's still there?" "I think it might be," Lucille said softly, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And I think it's time we found out." The story wasn't over. The house, with its deep foundations and whispering walls, held more secrets yet to be uncovered, more truths waiting to be revealed. As the fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls, the O'Neals knew that while one battle had ended, the journey was far from complete. The future, lit by the glow of reclaimed heritage and unwavering resolve, stretched before them, unknown, but theirs to claim. Discover the deeper truths that bind families and communities, and how even the quietest voices can change everything. Stay connected as we unlock more hidden chapters in this unforgettable story. Don't just hear the echoes of the past, be a part of the legacy that's still unfolding. The journey is far from over. Are you ready for what comes next?